The fire had burned down to coals by the time Caleb Stone opened the wooden trunk. Outside the cabin, November wind howled through the Montana pines, carrying the promise of another hard winter. Inside, lamplight painted shadows across rough-hewn walls, while his grandson watched from the old rocking chair. Daniel was 18, broad-shouldered and restless in the way young men get when the world beyond the mountains starts calling. Tomorrow he would ride down to Summit Springs, then on to the railroad that would carry him south to Panama. The canal work paid well, they said, good money for strong backs and men willing to risk yellow fever and mudslides in a jungle half a world away. Caleb lifted the Winchester from the trunk first. The rifle was old now, the bluing-worn silver where his hands had gripped the stock for 40 years. He set it across his knees with the reverence other men reserved for Bibles or family silver. Next came a rosary. The beads were tarnished, the crucifix bent slightly at the crossbar. It had been like that when he first saw it dangling from trembling fingers in the snow. Last he withdrew a small photograph, edges soft with age. The woman in the image wore what might have been a nun's habit, though the picture was too faded to be certain. Her eyes looked directly at the camera, clear and unafraid. Daniel leaned forward, firelight catching the curiosity in his face. The boy had his grandmother's eyes, that same direct gaze that saw through pretense to the truth underneath. "Before you leave these mountains for that jungle, boy," Caleb said, his voice still strong despite 70 years of living, "let me tell you about the winter a woman in black walked up this trail and taught me what's worth holding on to." The old man settled back in his chair, the Winchester resting easy in his weathered hands. Outside, the wind carried memories on its breath. And inside, by the dying fire, the past came alive again. It was November of 1876, and Caleb Stone was 35 years old. The mountains had been his home for 8 years by then, ever since the day he rode away from Fort Benton and the ruins of a life that was never meant to be his. The cabin he built sat at 9,000 feet, 3 hard days, ride from Summit Springs, and a lifetime away from the world of churches and calling cards and women who smiled with lies behind their teeth. He woke each morning in darkness, the way mountain men do, when survival depends on catching the day before it catches you. 4:30 by the old pocket watch his father had carried. The watch still kept time, even if his father did not bury these 20 years in soil Caleb had never seen. The cabin was a single room, 16 by 20, built from lodgepole pine he had cut and notched himself that first autumn. The logs had seasoned gray over the years, chinked tight with mud and moss against the wind that never stopped trying to get inside. A stone fireplace filled the north wall. River rocks hauled up from Elk Creek and mortared with clay from the bank. The chimney drew clean, rarely smoked, a source of quiet pride when pride was a luxury he allowed himself. His bed stood in the southwest corner, rope-strung frame, and a mattress stuffed with pine needles that he changed each fall. One table scarred and solid with 2 chairs he had built, though he never used the second. A shelf along the east wall held his guns, the Winchester, a Colt revolver, a heavy Sharps rifle for the times when elk or deer needed taking at distance. Food hung from the rafters in the old way. Venison and elk cut in strips and smoked over green aspen until the meat turned dark and would keep through the hardest winter. Sacks of beans and flour, a tin of salt, another of coffee. Simple provisions for a simple life, which was exactly what he wanted. The routine never changed because changing it served no purpose. He rose in darkness and stirred the coals in the fireplace, feeding and kindling until flames caught. Coffee went into the pot, snow water from the bucket by the door. While it boiled, he pulled on wool socks, then boots he had resoled twice and would resole again before spring. A heavy coat, fur lined and patched at the elbows, the hat that had seen him through 100 storms. Wolf waited by the door, a gray shape in the pre-dawn dimness. The animal was half dog, half timber. Wolf found as a pup with a bullet graze along his ribs 4 years back. Caleb had cleaned the wound and fed him scraps, expecting him to leave when he healed. Instead, Wolf stayed. They understood each other, he and the animal. Both were built for solitude, both suspicious of the world beyond the tree line. The trapline ran 6 miles following Elk Creek down through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine, then climbing back along the ridge where Martin and Fox traveled. Caleb checked it every morning, pulled his catches, reset the traps. The work was cold and careful, required attention, but not thought, which suited him fine. His hands knew what to do. His mind could wander where it would. By 8, he was back at the cabin skinning whatever the traps had yielded. Martin pelts brought good money in Summit Springs, where Jed McKenna bought them for resale to traders heading east. The work required a sharp knife and patience. Rush it and you ruin the hide. Take your time and you had something worth selling. The rest of the morning went to larger tasks. Firewood, always firewood. A man could never have enough when winter settled in hard. He had 4 cords split and stacked already, would need 6 to see him through to April. The axe rose and fell in steady rhythm, splitting rounds of lodgepole and aspen, the chunks tumbling aside to be stacked in neat rows under the cabin's overhang. Midday brought a simple meal, venison stew from the pot that hung over the fire, cornbread, if he felt ambitious, more often just jerky and cold water from the creek. Wolf got his share bones and scraps, then dozed by the fire while Caleb tended to the afternoon's work. There was always work, gear to mend traps, to repair the cabin's roof, to check for gaps where snow might work through. His saddle needed oil before the leather cracked. The water barrel by the door wanted refilling from the creek. A crack in the window needed packing with cloth before cold air could whistle through. He worked until light failed, which came early in November. By 4, the sun was touching the western peaks. By 5, shadow filled the valley. He lit the oil lamp, then a careful ritual, because oil was precious and had to be hauled up from Summit Springs twice a year. Dinner was whatever remained in the pot, eaten at the table while darkness pressed against the single window. Afterward, he sat by the fire with whatever book he had traded for on his last trip to town. The Bible read so many times he could quote whole passages. An old almanac from 1874, a copy of Robinson Crusoe with water stains on the cover and half the pages missing. He read until his eyes grew heavy, then banked the fire and climbed into bed. Wolf settled on the floor nearby, a warm presence in the darkness. And another day passed in the mountains, identical to the one before, which would be identical to the one that followed. 8 years of identical days. 8 years since he had ridden away from Fort Benton, and the woman who taught him that trust was a coin that could not be spent twice. Her name was Margaret Whitmore, and she was everything Caleb was not. Educated, refined, comfortable in drawing rooms and at dinner tables where men discussed politics and profit margins. Her father owned the largest mercantile in Fort Benton, had made a fortune supplying the fur trade and the army outposts that dotted the territory. Caleb had met her in the spring of 1868 when he was 27 and still believed that a man could have both mountains and a woman if he wanted them badly enough. He had come to town with a season's worth of pelts, flush with money, and restless after 6 months alone in the high country. She had smiled at him across the counter in her father's store, and something in that smile made him forget that he smelled of wood smoke and blood, that his hands were scarred and rough, that everything about him belonged to wilderness and nothing to civilization. They courted through that summer, if courting was the right word for what they did. He called on her at her father's house, sat stiff in parlors that smelled of furniture polish and felt like traps. She talked about St. Louis, where she had attended school, about theater and symphony concerts and worlds he had never seen and never wanted to. But when she looked at him, he felt like something more than just a trapper who wintered in the mountains. He felt like a man who might deserve fine things. By autumn, they were engaged. Her father approved, seeing in Caleb a hardworking man with profitable skills and no obvious vices. A wedding was planned for May, after the spring thaw made travel easier. Caleb found a house in town, small but respectable, close enough to the mountains that he could still trap in winter, but settled enough for a wife who deserved better than a cabin with 1 room and a dirt floor. He rode out that November for one last season alone, wanting to bring in enough pelts to start their married life with money in hand. The winter was hard but profitable. He worked his trap lines, survived 2 blizzards, shot a grizzly that tried to break into his cache. By April, he had more furs than he could carry, enough to fetch a price that would see them comfortable for a year. He came back to Fort Benton a week early, eager to see Margaret, to tell her about the profits to start the life they had planned. He found her in the house he had rented, in the bedroom that was supposed to be theirs. She was not alone. Thomas Brennan had been Caleb's partner in the fur trade, the man who bought his pelts and sold them east for profit. They split down the middle. He was educated like Margaret, smooth-voiced, where Caleb was rough, comfortable in the world of contracts and commerce. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched his future die. Margaret did not scream or cry. She simply looked at him with something like pity in her eyes and said the words that followed him into the mountains and stayed there still. I need more than silence and solitude, Caleb. Thomas can give me a life. You can only give me absence. He did not argue, did not fight, did not ask her to reconsider or beg for another chance. He simply turned and walked out of the house, out of Fort Benton, out of every plan he had made for a life that was not meant to be his. He rode into the Cabinet Mountains with everything he owned tied behind his saddle, and he did not come back. 8 years passed. He spoke to Jed McKenna when the old man brought supplies to whatever prospectors or hunters crossed his path and needed help or offered it. He went to Summit Springs twice a year to trade pelts for necessities, spent no more than a day in town, spoke to no one beyond what business required. The mountains did not lie, did not leave, did not promise one thing and deliver another. They simply were, and that was enough. Until the November afternoon when Wolf stopped on the trail and growled low in his chest, hackles rising as he stared at something Caleb could not yet see. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with snow that had not yet decided to fall. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees since morning, and the wind carried the smell of winter coming hard and fast. Caleb had been checking the trap line, his mind occupied with the prospect of cutting more firewood before the storm hit. Wolf's growl pulled him back to the present. The animal stood rigid, ears forward, every muscle tense. His gaze fixed on the trail that switched back down from the southern ridge. Caleb reached for the Winchester slung across his back, working the lever to chamber around. Mountain lions sometimes stalked these trails. Grizzlies too, though most were denned up by now. Whatever had Wolf on alert was something worth watching. He scanned the ridge, searching for movement among the pines. At first he saw nothing. Then a shape emerged from the trees, dark against the snow that dusted the trail. A person, walking, alone. Caleb pulled the spyglass from his coat pocket, extended. It focused on the figure. Through the lens, details sharpened. A woman, dressed in black, the garments hanging loose and shapeless. A nun's habit, if he was seeing right. No horse, no pack, nothing but the clothes she wore and whatever she carried beneath them. She moved slowly, each step deliberate and difficult. Even from 2 miles away, he could see she was struggling. Her path wavered, straightened, wavered again. She stopped, bent forward with hands on knees, then pushed on. The wind gusted strong enough to stagger her. She caught herself, kept walking. Caleb lowered the spyglass and looked at the sky. The storm would hit within the hour. The temperature would drop below zero once the sun set. No one survived a November night in the open, not at this elevation, not without shelter and fire and luck. His first instinct was to turn away. Not his problem, not his concern. The world below the mountains was full of people making poor choices and suffering the consequences. He had chosen to live apart from that world precisely because he did not want its problems becoming his. But Wolf whined, a sound he rarely made, and Caleb found himself watching the woman through the glass again. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the snow, stayed down for a long moment before pushing herself upright. He thought of Margaret, of trust, betrayed, and kindness used as weakness. He thought of 8 years alone, which had been safety, but also emptiness. He thought of his father, who once told him that a man was measured not by what he took from the world, but by what he gave when giving cost him something. Caleb swore under his breath, shoved the spyglass back in his pocket, and started down the trail toward her. The woman did not see him coming until he was 50 yards away. She raised her head, and even at that distance, he could see the fear flash across her face. She tried to stand straighter, tried to look less desperate than she obviously was. He stopped the horse 20 feet from her, studying her with the same caution he would give a wounded animal. Wounded things were dangerous even when they looked helpless. She was younger than he expected, late 20s maybe. Her face was pale beneath the dark fabric of the habit, her lips cracked and bloodless. The habit itself was torn in several places, stained with mud and pine pitch. She wore boots that were too large, men's boots, the kind prospectors or miners might wear. Her eyes were green. He noticed that even through his suspicion, even through the cold assessment that had kept him alive in places where mistakes meant death. Green like new aspen leaves, clear and direct, despite the exhaustion in her face. "Please," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "Sanctuary." The word hung in the frozen air between them. Caleb glanced at the sky, at the storm building along the peaks, then back at her. He dismounted without speaking, approached her slowly. Wolf circled, sniffing, growling, softly. The woman did not move, did not try to touch the animal or speak to it. Smart, Caleb thought. She knows enough to let a strange dog make up its own mind. Up close, he could see she was shaking. Not from fear, from cold. Her hands were bare fingers white at the tips. Frostbite if she was not careful. If she was not already past careful. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I can do whatever necessary," she said. He lifted her onto the horse with hands that remembered gentleness, though he had not used them gently in years. She weighed almost nothing, or maybe the cold had made her light. He swung up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her from sliding off. She stiffened at his touch, then relaxed. Necessity overcoming fear. He understood that, had made the same calculation many times. They rode back to the cabin in silence. The wind picked up, carrying the first flakes of snow. By the time the cabin came into view, the storm had arrived in earnest. He helped her down, unlocked the door, pushed it open. Wolf bounded inside and shook snow from his coat. The woman stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, looking at the interior with an expression he could not read. "Inside," Caleb said, "before you freeze." She stepped across the threshold. He followed, closing the door against the wind. The cabin was cold, the fire dead since morning. Caleb moved to the fireplace, shoved kindling into the ashes, struck a match. Flames caught and spread. He added larger wood, built the fire up until heat began to push back the chill. The woman stood where he had left her, dripping snowmelt onto the floor. Her teeth chattered audibly now that she had stopped moving. "Bed," Caleb said, pointing. "Get under the blankets, all of them." She did not argue. Walked to the bed on the unsteady legs, sat on the edge, tried to pull off the two large boots. Her hands shook too badly to manage the laces. Caleb knelt, unlaced them himself, pulled them off. Her feet were bare underneath, skin pale and cold. He wrapped them in a blanket, then helped her lie back and piled every other blanket in the cabin on top of her. She closed her eyes, still shaking. He turned back to the fire, added more wood, set a pot of snow to melt for water. While he waited for the water to heat, he studied her. The habit was not new, had been worn hard before she ever put it on. The fabric was wool, good quality, once now stained and torn. The rosary at her belt was silver, tarnished but ornate, too fine for most nuns he had seen. Her hands rested on top of the blankets. No calluses on the palms, but he saw small scars on her fingers. Not the marks of kitchen work or sewing. Something else. Field work, maybe. Farming. She spoke without opening her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said. "Storm's going to last through tomorrow. Maybe longer. You're stuck here until it clears. Better here than frozen on a mountain." He poured hot water into a cup, brought it to her. She struggled to sit up, to hold the cup steady. He wrapped his hand around hers, steadying it, helping her drink. The water was plain and hot, and she drank it like sacrament. When the cup was empty, she lay back again. "I'm Sister Mary Catherine," she said, "from St. Bridget's Convent in Kansas." Caleb set the cup aside. "Long walk from Kansas. Our wagon broke down 40 miles south. The others went for help. I tried to find shelter and got lost." It was a reasonable story, reasonable enough that most men would accept it without question. But Caleb had spent 8 years alone in mountains where trusting the wrong sign could get you killed. He had learned to read what was not said as much as what was. "Storm came up fast yesterday," he said, watching her face. "They'll be looking for you when it clears." Something flickered behind her eyes. Not relief, fear. "Yes," she said quietly, "they will." She fell asleep then, or maybe unconscious. Her breathing deepened, became regular. Caleb added more wood to the fire, then sat at the table and thought about the woman in his bed, the story that did not quite fit, in the winter that had just become more complicated than 8 years of identical days. Outside, the storm screamed against the walls. Inside, Wolf settled by the fire, watching the stranger with yellow eyes that missed nothing. Caleb did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the fire, the Winchester across his knees, and wondered what kind of trouble walked alone through a November blizzard wearing clothes that did not belong to her. By morning, he would start to find out. She woke at dawn, or what passed for dawn, through storm clouds that turned the sky the color of lead. Caleb had been awake all night, watching the fire, watching her, watching the way Wolf's ears followed every sound she made, even in sleep. He heard her breathing change, the shift from deep sleep to waking, heard the rustle of blankets as she sat up. When he turned from the fireplace where he had been adding wood, she was looking at him with those clear green eyes, fully alert despite whatever exhaustion or cold had brought her to his door. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I walked through a blizzard." A small smile touched her lips, then faded. "But alive. Because of you." "Coffee's hot." He poured 2 cups, brought one to her. She took it with both hands, grateful for the warmth. Her color was better today, the deathly pallor replaced by something closer to health. They drank in silence while outside the wind continued its assault on the cabin walls. Snow hissed against the window, piling up on the sill. Through the glass, Caleb could see nothing but white. "How long will the storm last?" she asked. "Day, maybe 2. November storms up here can go either way." She nodded, looked around the cabin. Taking inventory, he thought. 1 room, 1 bed, 1 man, the mathematics of the situation settling in. "I can sleep on the floor," he said. "Plenty of blankets." "You gave me your bed. I should take the floor." "You're recovering from near freezing. You keep the bed." She did not argue further, which told him she was smart enough to recognize practicality when she saw it. They finished their coffee. He set a pot of cornmeal mush to cook over the fire, plain food but filling. While it cooked, she watched him move around the cabin with the efficiency of long practice. "You live alone?" she asked. "Yes." "No family?" "Not anymore." She nodded as if she had expected the answer. "Me neither." He spooned the mush into 2 bowls, handed her one. They ate without speaking. When they finished, she set her bowl aside and looked at him directly. "I should help, with whatever needs doing. I won't be dead weight while I'm here." "You're a nun, not a hired hand." "I'm a woman who knows how to work." She stood, wrapped one of the blankets around her shoulders. "My grandfather had a farm in Ohio. I spent summers there before." She trailed off, some memory catching her. "Before I took vows. I can work." Caleb studied her. The habit hung loose on her frame, but underneath he could see the wiriness of someone accustomed to labor. Her hands, he had noticed last night, showed the small scars of work, even if they lacked heavy calluses. "Woodpile needs splitting," he said. "Kindling size. There's a hatchet by the door." She nodded, pulled the habit up, and tied it at her waist with a piece of rope he had not noticed her carrying. Practical, ready to work without the cloth tangling her legs. The day passed in the rhythm of storm-bound labor. Caleb ventured out to check on the small shed where he kept emergency supplies, came back snow-covered and half-frozen. She had split a pile of kindling in his absence, stacked it neatly under the overhang. By noon, the cabin felt like a trap despite its warmth. 2 people in one small room, circling each other with careful politeness. He worked on mending a trap that needed a new spring. She organized his food stores, wiping down jars and sacks, arranging things with a tidiness that made him vaguely uncomfortable because it implied permanence. They spoke little, small exchanges. "More coffee. Please. Hand me that blanket. Here." But silence between strangers is different than silence between people who know each other. It has weight, pressure, the unasked questions building like snow against a door. By evening, Caleb could not stand it anymore. "Tell me about St. Bridget's," he said while they ate dinner. Simple words, casual tone. Watching her face. She swallowed a bite of venison, met his eyes. "What do you want to know?" "How a convent lets one of its nuns wander off alone in wagon country." "We were relocating. New mission in Colorado. Wagon broken axle. The driver went for parts. I went looking for water and got turned around in the dark." It was the same story she had told before, delivered with the same calm certainty. But something in her voice caught just slightly on the word relocating. "And they'll find you when the storm clears," he said. "Yes." But her hands gripped the coffee cup tighter. Caleb let it rest. Pushed her too hard, and she would shut down entirely, or worse, leave as soon as the weather cleared and die in the process. That night he gave her the bed again, made himself a pallet by the fire. Wolf settled between them, an unconscious guard dog, though Caleb suspected the animal had already decided the woman was no threat. He dozed fitfully, aware of her breathing in the darkness, aware of how strange it was to share space with another human after so many years alone. The cabin felt smaller, also warmer in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. Morning of the second day brought clearing skies. The wind died. Through the window, sunlight glinted off snow that had drifted 3 feet deep against the north wall. Caleb went out to clear a path to the shed to check the damage. When he came back, she had made breakfast. Biscuits from the flour and lard, better than anything he had managed in months. Coffee strong and hot. She moved around his kitchen as if she had been doing it for years. "Where did a nun learn to make biscuits like this?" he asked. "My grandmother, before the farm was sold." "Thought you said your grandfather had the farm." She paused, just a heartbeat. "Both of them did. My grandmother was the one who taught me to cook." The slip was small, easy to overlook, but Caleb had learned to watch for the spaces between words where truth lived. After breakfast, he saddled up to ride down and check the trap lines, make sure no trees had fallen across the paths. She came outside, blinking in the bright snow glare. "I could come with you," she offered. "Learn the trails." "Better you stay, rest, get your strength back." What he meant was, "I need time away from you to think clearly." She seemed to understand, nodded, went back inside. He rode the trap line with Wolf, ranging ahead, checking the sets, pulling 3 marten from traps. Good catches. He reset the traps, covered his tracks, worked with the automatic precision of years. But his mind was not on the work. A nun alone, a story that did not quite hold together. Fear in her eyes when she talked about being found. Boots that were not hers. A rosary too fine for common use. Something was wrong with her story. The question was whether wrong meant dangerous. By the time he rode back, afternoon light was slanting golden through the pines. She had hauled water from the creek, a quarter-mile trek through knee-deep snow. The bucket sat by the door, full and waiting. Hard work for someone supposedly recovering from near freezing. That evening, as they ate dinner by lamplight, he decided to test the waters. "How long you been with St. Bridget's?" he asked. 3 years. "And before that, the farm in Ohio until my parents died." "Both at once. A year apart, father first, then mother. Fever took her." The grief in her voice sounded real. But grief could be real even in the midst of lies. He knew that better than most. "Hard thing losing both parents," he said. "Yes, but the church gave me purpose after, gave me a place to belong." "And now you're being relocated." "Yes." "To where in Colorado?" She hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "A mission near Denver, St. Catherine's." He filed the name away. St. Catherine, not St. Bridget. A different dedication, small detail, maybe meaningless, maybe not. On the 5th morning, hoofbeats sounded outside the cabin. Wolf barked once, sharp in warning. Caleb grabbed the Winchester, moved to the window. Through the glass, he saw Jed McKenna's old mule plodding up the trail, the mountain man hunched against cold that would have killed a younger man. Caleb opened the door. "Jed." "Caleb." The old man's eyes went past him, landing on the woman who stood by the fire. His eyebrows rose. "Entertaining company now." "Storm refugee," Caleb said. "Come in before you freeze." Jed dismounted stiffly, tied the mule, and stepped inside. He nodded to the woman, studied her with the frank curiosity of someone who had seen most things the mountains could offer and was still surprised occasionally. "Ma'am," he said. "Sir," she replied. Jed turned to Caleb. "Need to talk to you. Outside." They stepped onto the porch, leaving her inside with Wolf. The cold hit immediately, 15 below, and dropping as the sun settled toward the peaks. "What's the trouble?" Caleb asked. "Maybe nothing, maybe something." Jed pulled his coat tighter. 3 men rode into Summit Springs 4 days ago. Well-dressed, well-armed, asking questions. "What kind of questions?" "About a woman in nun's clothing who might have headed into the mountains." Caleb felt something cold settle in his gut that had nothing to do with the weather. "What did they say about her?" "That she stole from St. Catherine's mission in Kansas, money and valuable documents, offering $100 to anyone who helps find her." St. Catherine's, the name she had given him for the Colorado mission. Not where she was going, where she came from. "You tell them anything?" Caleb asked. "Told them snow's too deep, anyone up in the high country would be dead by now." They didn't look convinced. Jed studied him. "That her?" "She says she's from St. Bridget's, says her group broke down, she got lost looking for water." "Uh-huh, and I'm the King of England." Jed spat into the snow. "Look, you want my counsel? Send her down with me tomorrow. Whatever trouble she's in, it's her trouble. You don't need it. And if those men aren't lawmen," "That's exactly my point. They wore guns like men who use them, not like men who enforce law." Caleb looked back at the cabin at the smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, a woman who had lied to him, a woman running from something, a woman who had brought trouble to his doorstep, whether he wanted it or not. He thought of Margaret, of trust betrayed. He thought of his father, of the measure of a man. "I'll talk to her," he said. When he went back inside, she was standing by the fire, her back to him. She did not turn around. "I heard," she said quietly. "Heard what?" "Enough." She turned then, meeting his eyes. "Men are looking for me, offering money, and you're wondering if you should send me away." He did not deny it. "You lied to me." "I did." "Want to tell me why?" She was quiet for a long moment, hands clenching and unclenching. Then a decision made behind those green eyes. "St. Catherine's isn't a mission. It's a collection point." "For what?" "Women, orphans, widows, anyone desperate enough to believe a stranger offering food and shelter." Understanding came slow and cold. "Trafficking. They call it placement. Jobs in mining towns and railroad camps. Respectable work, they say. But the ledger I saw had prices next to names. Prices paid. Locations sent. And you stole this ledger." "I memorized it, then burned it. 47 names, every woman, every buyer, every place." Caleb sat down slowly at the table. "Why?" "Because someone needed to. Because those women deserve better than being sold like cattle." Her voice shook, not with fear, but with anger. "I was going to the federal marshal in Helena, going to testify. And the men looking for you show, not lawmen, enforcers. The operation's bigger than one mission. Reach into territory, government, local law. Sheriff in Kansas has his name in that ledger. So you came to the mountains." "So I ran." She looked at him directly. "And I walked into a stranger's life and brought my trouble with me. So yes, you should send me away. You should protect yourself." She started toward the door, moving with purpose despite having nowhere to go. Caleb stood, stepped between her and the exit. "Where exactly would you go?" "Somewhere that's not your problem." "In November, in the mountains, with men hunting you." "I've survived this long. By luck, luck runs out." She met his eyes, defiant. "Then it runs out. Better than making you pay for kindness with trouble." They stood there 2 feet apart, the air between them charged with more than just argument. Outside, Jed's mule stamped in the snow. Inside, the fire crackled. Caleb thought of 8 years alone. 8 years of safety purchased with isolation. 8 years of identical days that had protected him from everything except emptiness. He thought of the way she had worked without complaint, the way she had organized his chaos into order, the small kindnesses coffee made without asking, firewood split, and stacked quiet companionship that asked for nothing. He thought of the fact that for 5 days his cabin had felt less like a tomb and more like a home. "You can stay through winter," he heard himself say. She blinked. "What?" "Storm season's just starting. Be March before the pass is clear enough for safe travel. You stay here. We figure out how to get you to a real marshal come April." "You don't know me. Don't know if anything I said is true." "No, but I know those men. The kind who buy women. The kind who wear guns like tools. I know what they'll do if they find you. And you'd risk harboring me anyway." He thought about that. About risk and trust and the cost of caring what happened to someone else. "Yes," he said simply. She studied his face, searching for the lie, the angle, the selfish reason underneath. When she found none, something in her softened. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. Winter up here is hard. Isolation's harder. By March, you might be begging to leave." A ghost of a smile. "I've survived worse than hard winters." That night, after Jed had ridden back down the mountain with promises to bring word, if the men asked more questions, Caleb lay on his pallet by the fire and listened to her breathing in the bed. Wolf was curled between them again, but something had shifted. The space they shared felt less like two strangers waiting out a storm and more like two people who had chosen, however tentatively, to trust each other with truth. Through the window, stars burned cold and clear in a sky swept clean by the storm. Inside, the fire settled into coals. Tomorrow they would begin building something more permanent than shelter from weather. They would begin building the thing that had brought her to his door and made him open it. They would begin building trust, that fragile thing he had buried 8 years ago and thought he would never risk again. Outside in the darkness, far down the mountain, three men sat in a Summit Springs boarding house and planned their next move. They were patient men. Winter was long. The woman could not hide forever. But for tonight, she was safe. For tonight, she slept in a mountain cabin with a man who had learned the hard way what trust cost and was choosing against all wisdom to pay that price again. The second week brought rhythm where there had been only caution. Sarah rose before Caleb, now had coffee boiling by the time he returned from checking the trap lines at dawn. She did not ask permission anymore, simply moved through the cabin's routines as if she had always been part of them. He would come in from the cold to find her scraping yesterday's hides, the work careful and competent, or mending his shirts with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, or cutting vegetables for stew with a knife she had sharpened herself on the whetstone by the door. They ate breakfast together in the gray light before sunrise, cornmeal mush or biscuits venison if there was any left from dinner. The meals were simple, but she made them feel like something more, a shared ritual that marked the day's beginning. "You planning to check the upper trap line today?" she would ask. "If the weather holds. I could come, learn the territory. Better you stay close in case those men come looking." She never argued, though he saw the flash of frustration in her eyes. Being confined, even for safety, went against her nature. He understood that. Understood, too, that she was not asking to come out of boredom, but out of a need to be useful to contribute to earn her place through work. So he found tasks for her, the endless tasks that filled a mountain winter. She hauled water from the creek, a quarter-mile trek through snow that deepened daily, filled the barrels inside, kept them from freezing by banking coals near them at night. She split kindling with the small hatchet, her technique improving each day until she could split a cord in the time it had taken her to split half that much her first week. She learned to read the weather the way he did, watching the sky for the signs of coming storms, the way clouds built over the western peaks, the particular quality of cold that meant snow within hours, the stillness that settled before a blizzard. They worked side by side in companionable silence, the kind that develops between people who trust each other's competence. When he climbed onto the roof to check for damage from the last storm, she steadied the ladder without being asked. When she struggled to move a heavy sack of grain, he simply stepped in and lifted it, then stepped back and let her finish organizing the storage. Small gestures, small acknowledgments, building trust one careful action at a time. On the 12th day, he found her examining the Winchester where it hung on the wall. "You know how to shoot?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me. Long gun for deer, but I'm not practiced." Caleb took the rifle down, checked the action out of habit. "Might be good if you knew, just in case." He did not say, in case of what, did not need to. They both knew men were looking for her. That afternoon, when the sun was high enough to provide decent light, he took her out to the clearing behind the cabin. Set up targets at 50, 100, and 150 yards. Split logs with charcoal marks at center. The Winchester felt heavy in her hands at first. She held it wrong, the stock too low on her shoulder, her grip uncertain. "Here," Caleb said, and stepped behind her, adjusted her stance, feet planted solid, brought the stock up tight against her shoulder, wrapped his hands over hers on the rifle, showing her the proper hold. He was aware of her warmth against him, the way her hair smelled of wood smoke, and the lye soap she used for washing. Aware, too, of how long it had been since he had stood this close to another person, close enough to feel breathing and heartbeat. "Breathe slow," he said, his voice low near her ear. "Let half out. Hold. Squeeze, don't pull." She did as instructed. The rifle cracked, kicking back into her shoulder. Downrange snow exploded 2 feet left of the target. "Pulled left," he said, anticipated the recoil. "Trust the rifle. It won't hurt you if you hold it right." They worked through a box of cartridges. Her shots improved, moving closer to center. By the 20th round, she hit the 50-yard target, not dead center, but close enough to count. When the rifle cracked and the charcoal mark disappeared, she turned to him with a smile that transformed her face. Pure joy, uncomplicated and real. "I hit it," she said, and the wonder in her voice made something shift in his chest. "You did. Can I try again?" They kept shooting until the light began to fail. By then, she could hit the 50-yard target 3 times out of 5, the 100-yard target occasionally. The 150 she never touched, but Caleb did not expect her to. That distance required practice and patience, and time they might not have. Walking back to the cabin through snow that glowed blue in the twilight, she said something that stayed with him. Thank you for teaching me. Practical skill. You should know. No, I mean, thank you for letting me choose this. She stopped and looked at him directly. Everything else in my life the last 3 years was done to me, decided for me. This I chose to learn. He nodded, understanding more than she said. Freedom was not just escaping danger. It was choosing your own path, even if the path was something as simple as learning to shoot straight. That night, they sat by the fire longer than usual, neither ready to sleep. She asked about his life before the mountains questions he usually deflected. But tonight, with the wind howling outside and the fire warm between them, he found himself answering. He told her about the army, about scouting for Union forces during the war, about learning to read land and weather and the signs that meant ambush or safety, about coming home to nothing. No family left, no place that felt like home until he found these mountains. He did not tell her about Margaret. That wound was still too close, still too raw, despite 8 years of trying to forget. Sarah shared pieces of her own history. The farm in Ohio, her grandfather teaching her to work the land. Her parents' deaths, the loneliness after. The man who had come to her mother's funeral calling himself Father Josiah Blackwood, offering hope and purpose and a place to belong. I believed him, she said quietly. Wanted to believe. Needed something to make sense of losing everything. And when you realize what St. Catherine's really was, I kept my head down for 6 months. Worked in the kitchen, cleaned, did everything they asked, watched, listened, gathered evidence in case I ever got the chance to run. Why not run sooner? Fear and shame, I think, that I had been so stupid to believe him, that I had let myself be used. She stared into the fire, but mostly fear. What changed? A girl arrived. Couldn't have been more than 15. I heard Blackwood talking to one of his men about where she would fetch the best price. And I thought about that child, about what would happen to her, and fear stopped being enough reason to stay silent. Caleb understood that kind of courage. The kind that came not from absence of fear, but from finding something that mattered more than being afraid. The ledger was in his office, he asked, hidden in a false bottom drawer. I memorized every entry over 3 nights. Then I stole a habit from the laundry, walked out before dawn, and never looked back. They sat in silence after that, the fire crackling, Wolf snoring softly in the corner. Outside, the wind had died, leaving a stillness that felt heavy with unspoken things. Finally, Sarah said, Caleb, when spring comes and I testify what happens after, Marshall will probably want you somewhere safe, new territory, new name maybe, another place where I have to pretend to be someone I'm not. Better than dead. Is it? She looked at him. These weeks here, I've been more myself than I've been in 3 years. Working until I'm tired. Eating food I helped make. Going to sleep knowing I'm safe. Out there, I'll always be running. Always looking over my shoulder. Out there, you'll be alive. And here, the question hung between them, weighted with meanings neither was quite ready to name. Here meant the cabin, meant winter, meant this careful partnership they had built. Meant, if he was honest, something more than temporary shelter. Here isn't permanent, he said. Come April, you have to move. Why, Plume? Because that's how it works. Or because you're afraid if I stay, you might want me to. He did not answer, could not answer, because she was right and they both knew it. She stood, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. Good night, Caleb. Good night. She went to bed. He stayed by the fire thinking about the question she had asked and the answer he had not given. Emma Crawford arrived on the 18th day, riding up the mountain on a skinny bay mare, despite her father's probable objections. She was 15, whip-thin and fearless, in the way of children who had not yet learned the world could break them. Caleb heard the horse before he saw it, went to the door with the Winchester. Wolf barked once, then wagged his tail. The animal had met Emma before during Caleb's rare trips to Summit Springs. The girl swung down from her horse, all energy and urgency. Mr. Stone, Emma, your pa know you're up here. He knows. She glanced past him at Sarah, who had appeared in the doorway. Brought a message from Ma. Says any Christian woman is welcome to Sunday dinner when weather permits. Sarah smiled. That's kind of her. Also brought a warning. Emma's expression turned serious. Those 3 men. They're still in town, staying at the boarding house. Keep asking about trails leading up here. Caleb felt Sarah tense beside him. What did people tell them? Most folks say the same as Mr. McKenna, that nobody's up in the high country this time of year, that anyone who was would be dead by now. Emma grinned. But everyone knows you're up here, just nobody's saying. Your father included. Pa says the truth's important, but so's protecting the innocent. He's still deciding which matters more in this case. Smart man Reverend Crawford knew when silence was its own kind of testimony. Emma stayed long enough to warm herself by the fire to accept coffee and biscuits that Sarah pressed on her. The girl studied Sarah with open curiosity. You really a nun? She asked. Sarah paused. I wore the habit, but I never took final vows. So you could leave if you wanted. I already did. Emma seemed to understand more than she said. She finished her coffee, stood to go. Ma really does want you for Sunday dinner, when it's safe. She says any woman brave enough to walk into these mountains in November deserves a proper meal. After she left, Sarah stood on the porch watching the girl ride back down the trail. She's fearless. She's young, hasn't learned fear yet. I hope she never does. But they both knew she would. Everyone learned eventually. That night, as they ate dinner by lamplight, Sarah brought up the subject he had been avoiding. Caleb, we need to talk about what happens if those men come up here. They won't make it, not in winter. But if they do, he set down his fork, then we deal with it. However necessary. She shook her head. I won't let you fight my battles. Little late for that. You're living under my roof, eating my food. That makes it my business. I could leave tonight before I bring more trouble. Where would you go in the dark, in the snow? You'd be dead before morning. Then what do you suggest? He thought about it, about 3 men with guns and ill intentions, about a woman who had already survived more than most would, about a cabin that could be defended if it came to that. We prepare, he said finally. Make sure the shutters bar from inside, stock extra ammunition, set up signals with Jed in case we need help. You'd risk your life for me. It was not a question, but he answered anyway. Yes. Why? Because you make coffee in the morning, because you organize my chaos into order, because for 18 days this cabin has felt less like a tomb and more like a home. He did not say any of that. Instead, because it's the right thing to do. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for the lie underneath. When she found none, she nodded. Then we prepared together. Over the next days, they fortified the cabin. Caleb cut heavy bars for the shutters, fitted them with brackets that would hold against force. Sarah counted ammunition, organized it by caliber, created caches in different parts of the cabin in case one location was compromised. They worked together with the efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on preparation. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words, just the quiet competence of shared purpose. On the 22nd day, the worst storm of the season hit. It came fast, the way November blizzards do in the high country. Caleb saw it building over the western peaks at noon, knew they had maybe 3 hours before it arrived. He brought in extra firewood, filled every water bucket, made sure the barn was secured. By 3 o'clock, the wind was screaming. By 4, visibility dropped to nothing. Snow came horizontal, driven by gusts that shook the cabin's walls. The temperature plummeted 10 below 1520. Cold that could kill in minutes if you were caught outside. They were trapped, completely isolated. Even if someone wanted to reach them, the storm made it impossible. Caleb had been through worse blizzards, had weathered storms that lasted 4 days and buried the cabin to the eaves. But he had always been alone. Now with Sarah in the cabin, the space felt different, smaller, more charged with possibilities he had spent 8 years avoiding. The first day of the storm, they stayed busy. Caleb repaired traps. Sarah mended clothes. They cooked, cleaned red. Normal activities to fill abnormal time. The second day, tension crept in. 2 people in one small room with nowhere to go and nothing to distract from each other's presence. Every sound magnified, every movement noticed. The air between them thick with words unsaid. By evening, Sarah was pacing energy with no outlet. Caleb sat at the table trying to read, but aware of every step she took. I can't do this anymore. You see? She said suddenly. He looked up alarmed. Do what? Pretend we're just waiting for spring. Pretend this is temporary. Pretend I don't feel. She stopped, hands clenched at her sides. Feel what? She turned to face him. Like I found where I belong. And it's terrifying because I know you'll send me away. Caleb stood slowly. I'm not sending you away. You have to go. For safety. What if I'd rather risk danger than leave what's real? You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? She crossed the small space between them, took his hand, placed it over her heart. He could feel it beating fast and strong beneath his palm. I've pretended enough for one lifetime, she said. What I feel right now, that's the only true thing I have. He should step back, should put distance between them, should remember Margaret in broken trust, in 8 years of safety, purchased with solitude. Instead, he pulled her close. The kiss was slow and deep, 8 years of loneliness breaking against the shore of human connection. She tasted like coffee and wood smoke, and something sweet he could not name. Her hands came up to his face, holding him like something precious that might disappear. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he said the words that had been building for days. If we do this, it can't be halfway. I won't be a convenience you leave when you get scared. And I won't be a secret you hide when you're ashamed. Then we do this right. No sneaking, no pretending. She looked at him, understanding what he was offering. Are you asking me to marry you? I'm saying if you stay, we share this life fully. As partners. As husband and wife, even if only the mountain and God witness it. No priest. Nearest church is Summit Springs. We'd have to wait for spring thaw to get there. But up here, a man's word to a woman before God counts for something. She was quiet, and for a moment he thought she would refuse. Thought she would choose the safer path of temporary shelter over the risk of permanent commitment. Then she smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over the peaks. I give you my word, Caleb Stone, through whatever comes. And I give you mine, Sarah Bennett. They stood facing each other by Firelight Wolf as witness and spoke the vows that would bind them more surely than any paper. For better or worse, in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, till death parts us. When Caleb kissed her this time, it was as his wife. The storm raged for 3 more days. They did not leave the bed except for necessities. Learned each other in the way of newly married people with tenderness and awkwardness and growing confidence. Built between them something that felt stronger than the walls that sheltered them. On the morning the storm finally broke, Sarah woke in his arms and said, "No regrets. Only that I didn't find you 8 years ago." She laughed, the sound filling the cabin with light. "You wouldn't have wanted me 8 years ago. I was a different person, scared, uncertain, trying to be what everyone expected. And now I know who I am, a woman who walks into blizzards and trusts mountain men and speaks vows by firelight." He pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair. "What kind of mountain man would I be if I didn't keep you?" They spent the morning in small domesticities that felt profound, making breakfast together, her wearing his shirt, him braiding her hair the way she taught him. Easy touches, comfortable silence. The intimacy of people who had chosen each other deliberately. When Jed arrived that afternoon riding through snow that sparkled in the sunshine, he took one look at them and knew. "Well," he said, settling by the fire with coffee Sarah poured, "you two look different." "We're married," Caleb said simply. Jed's eyebrows rose. Married or mountain married. "Spoke vows before God 5 days ago. That make it real enough for you." The old man studied them. Both saw the way Sarah's hand rested on Caleb's shoulder, the way his fingers laced through hers without thought. He nodded slowly. "Congratulations, then." To Sarah, "You know what you signed up for, this old grump?" She smiled. "He's not so grumpy when he doesn't want to be." Jed laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling. Then his expression turned serious. "Got news from town. Those 3 men hired 4 more. 7 total now. Bought heavy winter gear. They're planning to come up." Sarah's hand tightened on Caleb's shoulder. "When week, maybe 2. Waiting for the next break in weather." "I should leave," Sarah said. "Draw them away." Caleb turned to look at her. "You're my wife now. We face this together." Jed watched the exchange, then said, "There might be another way." Reverend Crawford's sympathetic. So are several townspeople. They suspect the story about stolen money is horse shit. "How does that help us?" Caleb asked. "If we can prove that those men are criminals, not lawmen, the town will turn. Might not fight for you, but won't help them either." Sarah straightened. "I can prove it. I have the ledger memorized. 47 names, every woman they sold, every buyer, every location. You write that down, Jed said. I'll take it to the Reverend. Let him decide how to use it. Over the next hour, Sarah wrote everything she remembered. Names, dates, prices, locations. The evidence filled 3 pages in careful handwriting. When she finished, she handed it to Jed. This puts you in danger, Caleb said to her. I'm already in danger. At least this way it means something. After Jed left, promising to return with news, they spent the week preparing. Caleb taught Sarah to reload the Winchester while he fired a rhythm they practiced until it became smooth. They positioned water barrels inside food caches, ammunition stores. Created a plan for what to do if the cabin was surrounded. The plan was simple: hold out until help arrived. Jed would gather men from town if needed. All they had to do was survive long enough. On the 45th day, during the work of checking trap lines, Sarah said something that changed everything. Caleb, can I ask you something? Always. What would you do if I wasn't running from anything, if I was just a woman who wanted to stay in these mountains? He paused, considered. I'd ask what you wanted from this life, because it's hard, isolated, not much to offer a woman. I've been alone in crowds. I'd rather be alone with one person who sees me. And you think I see you. I think you're the first person who ever has. That night, lying in bed with her in his arms, he thought about her question, about what life would be like after the threat passed, after spring came and she could testify and the danger was over. He thought about waking every morning to find her beside him, about building a life together in these mountains, about maybe someday children playing in the cabin where only silence had lived for 8 years. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. On the 55th day, Sarah woke feeling ill. She made it outside before vomiting, came back pale and shaking. Caleb watched her with concern. Could be bad meat, he said. I've been feeling strange for days, tired, sick in the mornings. She looked at him, and I've missed my monthly. Twice now. Understanding came slowly then, all at once. You're pregnant. I think so. He stared at her tools forgotten in his hands. A child, their child. The possibility had not even crossed his mind, too caught up in the present to think about futures that far ahead. You're sure, he asked. Not completely, but I know my body. I know what this feels like. Caleb crossed to her, knelt, placed his hands on her belly. A child. Our child. If I'm right. He looked up at her, saw fear and hope mixed in equal measure. Then we end this before the baby comes, before you're vulnerable, before our child is born into fear, she agreed. That night they held each other closer than usual, aware of the new life growing between them, aware too that time was running out. 7 men were coming, a child was coming, and winter still had 3 months left to run. Emma arrived breathless. 2 weeks later, her horse lathered despite the cold. They left town this morning, she said without preamble. 7 men heavily armed heading up the mountain. Caleb felt everything inside him go cold and focused. How long are they? They're on foot, moving slow in the snow, maybe 2 days before they reach you. He looked at Sarah, saw her hand rest protectively on her belly. Not showing yet, but the gesture was instinctive. Thank you, Emma. Get home safe. After the girl left, he and Sarah made final preparations, barred the shutters, loaded every weapon, positioned ammunition within easy reach. That evening, Jed arrived with news that shifted everything. Reverend Crawford read Sarah's testimony to the town council, the old man said. 3 of the women named in that ledger, they were from families around Summit Springs. When people heard their daughters' names, their sisters' names, everything changed. Changed how? Caleb asked. Town voted. Sheriff was told to order those men to leave. He refused, so the Reverend's gathering volunteers. 8, maybe 10 men willing to ride up tomorrow. Sarah shook her head. I won't let good people die for me. Too late, Jed said. This isn't about you anymore. It's about their daughters, their sisters, their wives. You gave them names, proof. Now they want justice. Caleb understood. This was not charity. This was community protecting its own. Sarah had become part of Summit Springs, whether she had ever set foot in town or not. When do they ride? He asked. Dawn. Should reach the lower trail by midday. And the 7 men already camped 5 miles down. They'll move at first light too. which meant tomorrow would see a confrontation. The only question was where and how. That night, Sarah and Caleb sat on the porch, despite the cold, watching stars wheel overhead. Wolf lay between them, alert to every sound carried on the wind. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes, but not of them, of losing what we've built. We built it strong, it'll hold." He hoped she was right, hoped that whatever came tomorrow, they would still be standing together when it was done. Inside, the fire burned low. Outside, the mountains held their breath. And somewhere in the darkness, 14 men moved toward a convergence that would decide everything. Sarah's hand found his in the darkness. "Whatever comes tomorrow, I don't regret choosing this. Choosing you." "Neither do I." They sat until the cold drove them inside, then lay together in the bed they had shared for months now. Neither slept well. Both listened to the night sounds, wondering what dawn would bring. By morning, they would know. The sun rose clear and cold on the 47th day. Caleb was already awake, had been for hours. He stood at the window watching the trail, the Winchester loaded and ready. Sarah moved around the kitchen, making coffee despite her morning sickness, refusing to be sidelined by pregnancy or fear. She had loaded the Colt, positioned it within easy reach. They did not speak. Words seemed inadequate for what might come. At 8 o'clock, Wolf growled. Caleb raised the spyglass, focused on movement far down the trail. 7 men on foot moving slow through deep snow. They stopped a mile out, seemed to be discussing strategy. Then they continued forward. At 9, Jed appeared from the east, riding hard. With him came 8 men from Summit Springs. Reverend Crawford led them, looking uncomfortable on horseback but determined. "We're positioned on the lower trail," Jed called, "between the cabin and them. They want to reach you. They go through us." Caleb felt something ease in his chest. Not relief, but something close. They were not alone in this. By 10 o'clock, the 7 men reached the point where the town's defenders waited. Through the spyglass, Caleb watched the confrontation unfold. Words were exchanged. He could not hear them, but he could see the body language. The 7 men, confident and aggressive. The townspeople, fewer in number, but holding their ground. Then one of the townspeople stepped forward, Reverend Crawford holding up papers, speaking loudly enough that his voice carried on the still air. More words. Argument. The leader of the 7 men, well-dressed even in the wilderness, gesturing angrily. Then movement on the ridge above. Emma Crawford appeared, a Winchester in her hands, aimed down at the 7 men. Behind her, 4 more townspeople emerged from the trees. Caleb smiled. Ambush. The townspeople had prepared better than he expected. Through the spyglass, he saw the moment the 7 men realized they were surrounded. Saw them calculate odds, count rifles, understand that whatever they had been paid was not worth dying in the snow. The confrontation lasted another 10 minutes. Then the 7 men turned and started back down the mountain. Slowly at first, then faster until they were gone from view. Caleb lowered the spyglass. Beside him, Sarah let out a breath she had been holding. "It's over," she asked. "For now." Jed rode up an hour later, grinning. "Should have seen them. Tails between their legs like whipped dogs." "What did Crawford say to them?" "Told them we had written testimony from 8 women they trafficked. Told them the federal marshal in Helena has copies. Told them they had 2 choices. Leave now or be arrested." They believed him about the marshal. Marshall arrived in Summit Springs 3 days ago. Been investigating based on Sarah's deposition. Issued warrants yesterday. Sarah's eyes widened. Warrants? For trafficking, for fraud, for half a dozen other charges. Jed looked at her with something like respect. "Your testimony, what you memorized, it all checked out. 8 other women corroborated the story. You brought down a whole network." That evening, the townspeople came to the cabin. 15 people crowding into the small space, bringing food, bringing congratulations, bringing acceptance. Reverend Crawford shook Caleb's hand. "Your wife is a brave woman." "I know." To Sarah, "You gave us the courage to stand. That's worth more than you know." They shared a meal, cramped and noisy and chaotic. Emma held Wolf's head in her lap. Jed told exaggerated stories. Someone produced a fiddle, played mountain songs that had everyone singing. Caleb stood in the corner, watching Sarah move through the crowd, smiling, accepting thanks, looking more at home than he had ever seen her. This was what she had missed at St. Catherine's. Not just safety, community, belonging. Later, after everyone left, she came to him on the porch. "We should make it official." the marriage for the baby's sake. Already planning on it, soon as we can get down to town. Spring. Spring. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders. I like your friends. They're your friends now, too. I never had friends before, not real ones. You do now. They stood together, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Behind them, the cabin was warm and waiting. Ahead, spring would come, eventually bringing with it new life and new beginnings. But for tonight, they were safe. They were together. They were home. December came hard and cold. The mountains settled into deep winter snow, measured in feet instead of inches. The cabin was completely isolated now. No travel possible except in the brief windows between storms. But isolation felt different with two. With Sarah moving through the rooms, her belly beginning to show. With shared meals and shared work and shared warmth on the coldest nights. Caleb built a cradle from pine, working on it by firelight, while Sarah knitted small clothes from yarn Emma had brought. They did not talk about the future much, simply lived each day as it came. On Christmas, they exchanged gifts. He gave her a wooden spoon he had carved the handle shaped like a mountain range. She gave him socks she had knitted thick and warm and perfect. Merry Christmas, husband, she said. Merry Christmas, wife. It was enough. January brought the coldest temperatures 30 below on the worst nights. They stayed close to the fire, rationing firewood, making it last. Sarah's morning sickness had passed, but she tired easily now, the pregnancy taking its toll. Caleb took over more of the work, insisted she rest. She argued, but not hard, knowing the baby needed her strength. On a night when the wind howled like wolves and the cold crept through every crack, they lay together in bed and talked about names. Samuel, if it's a boy, Caleb said, after my father. I like that. And if it's a girl, you choose. Rebecca, my grandmother's name. Rebecca Stone has a good sound. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, do you think we'll be good parents? I think we'll love our child. That's most of what matters. And the rest, we'll figure out as we go, same as everything else. She laughed softly. I never planned to be a mother in a mountain cabin. I never planned to be a father at all. Are you happy about the baby? He thought about that, about the fear and joy mixed together, about the responsibility and the wonder of new life. Yes, he said, terrified, but happy. Me too. February brought the first hints of spring, though snow still fell and cold still bit, but the sun stayed up a little longer each day. The light changed, becoming less harsh, more golden. Sarah's belly was round now, unmistakable. She moved more carefully, one hand often resting on the curve of life growing inside her. Caleb found himself watching her, constantly marveling at the changes, the strength it took to carry a child in such harsh conditions. They made plans for the birth. Jed would bring Mrs. Henderson, the midwife, up from Summit Springs when the time came. They had clean cloth, ready hot water, always available, a space prepared beside the fireplace where warmth would be steady. On the first day of March, Sarah's water broke. The labor started slowly, mild contractions that came and went through the morning. Sarah walked through them, worked through them, refusing to be confined to bed until absolutely necessary. By afternoon, the contractions were stronger. Coming closer together, Caleb sent Jed, who had arrived with supplies, back down for Mrs. Henderson. Might not make it in time, Jed warned. Trail's still rough. Try anyway. By evening, Sarah was in serious labor. Caleb had never felt so helpless in his life. He could track elk through a blizzard, could survive alone in wilderness that killed most men, but watching his wife in pain and being unable to help broke something in him. I'm here was all he could say, holding her hand through each contraction. I'm right here. I know, she gasped between pains. I know. The labor went on through the night. Mrs. Henderson arrived near midnight, took charge with the brisk efficiency of someone who had delivered dozens of babies. Jed stayed outside, keeping the fire going, heating water ready to help if needed. Caleb stayed beside Sarah, anchoring her through each wave of pain, whispering encouragement, wiping sweat from her face, being the steady presence she needed. Near dawn, after 16 hours of labor, their son was born. Mrs. Henderson cleaned him, wrapped him in soft cloth, placed him in Sarah's arms. The baby's cry filled the cabin, strong and healthy and alive. Caleb looked at his son, at Sarah, exhausted but glowing, and felt something in his chest crack open. Love so fierce it hurt. Fear so deep it shook him. gratitude so profound he had no words. Samuel, Sarah whispered, looking at the tiny face. Samuel Stone. The baby had dark hair like Caleb, green eyes like Sarah, 10 perfect fingers, 10 perfect toes, a miracle wrapped in flannel. Caleb touched his son's cheek with one rough finger, marveling at the softness. Welcome to the mountains, boy. They slept in shifts over the next days, learning the rhythms of infant care. Feeding, changing, soothing, crying that seemed to have no cause. Exhausting, overwhelming, beautiful. Jed visited often, bringing supplies, bringing news from town. Emma came as soon as the trail was passable, her eyes going wide at the sight of the baby. He's so small, she breathed. You were smaller once, Sarah said, smiling. Can I hold him? Sarah showed her how careful and gentle. Emma sat by the fire with Samuel in her arms, looking awed and terrified in equal measure. A week after the birth, Caleb stood on the porch at dawn, his son in his arms. The sun was rising over the peaks, painting snow gold and pink. In his arms, Samuel made small sleeping sounds. This is your home, Caleb said quietly. These mountains, this life your mother and I chose. Someday you'll choose your own path. But know that you were wanted, that you were born into love. That matters more than anything. Inside, Sarah called his name. Time to nurse the baby again. Caleb went back inside, back to his wife and son, back to the life that had begun with a woman walking up a snowy trail and asking for sanctuary. He had given her shelter. She had given him everything else. 4 days after Samuel's birth, Emma Crawford rode up the mountain with news that turned peace into preparation. The girl arrived at midday and her horse blowing hard from the climb. Caleb met her at the door, Samuel sleeping against his shoulder. The contrast must have been striking, he thought. A mountain man holding an infant with the careful terror of new fatherhood. Mr. Stone, Emma said, breathless. They're back. Inside, Sarah looked up from where she sat by the fire, still recovering from childbirth. Her face went pale. How many? Caleb asked. 10 this time. Rode into Summit Springs yesterday. Said they're finishing what they started. Caleb felt ice settle in his gut. 10 men. More than before. Determined enough to try again despite the winter. Despite the failed first attempt. When are they moving? He asked. Pa heard them talking at the boarding house. Tomorrow, maybe the day after, waiting for the weather to hold. Sarah stood careful, one hand braced against the wall. I need to leave. Draw them away from here. No, Caleb's voice was flat final. You just gave birth 4 days ago. You can't travel. You can barely walk. Then what do we do? Emma stepped forward. Pa's already gathering men, 20 willing to ride up. Maybe more. He sent me ahead to warn you. 20 men against 10. Better odds than last time. But the math was not what worried Caleb. It was Sarah's condition. Samuel's vulnerability. The fact that his family was trapped with nowhere to run. Tell your father we're grateful, he said to Emma. But tell him to stay back. I won't have good people dying for this. Too late, Emma said simply. They're already packing. They'll be here by tomorrow night. After she left, Caleb and Sarah faced each other across the cabin. Samuel had woken and was fussing, hungry again. Sarah took him, began to nurse with movements that were still awkward, still new. We fortify, Caleb said. Board the windows tighter. Position ammunition. Set up in the root cellar if it comes to that. The root cellar is freezing. We can't keep Samuel there for long. We won't have to. The town's sending 20 men. This ends tomorrow one way or another. That night, Mrs. Henderson stayed to help with the baby while Caleb prepared. He moved food and water into the root cellar, created a space where Sarah and Samuel could shelter if shooting started, positioned rifles at each window, checked and rechecked ammunition. Sarah watched from the bed where she was supposed to be resting. You're planning for war. I'm planning to protect my family. I brought this to your door. He crossed to her, knelt beside the bed. You brought yourself to my door. Everything else came with you, good and bad. I chose to open that door. Don't regret my choices for me. She touched his face. I don't want you to die for me. Then we both better live. Samuel cried. Sarah soothed him. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow. Another storm building. Maybe that would delay the men. Maybe not. Caleb did not sleep that night. He sat by the window with the Winchester, watching the trail, waiting for dawn. Morning came gray and cold. The storm had passed without breaking, leaving the sky heavy with the promise of snow that refused to fall. Caleb had been watching the trail since first light, knowing they would come, but not knowing when. At 9 o'clock, Wolf growled, low and sustained the sound he made when he sensed danger. Caleb raised the spyglass, scanned the lower trail. Movement. Men on horseback this time, not on foot like before. 10 of them spread out, moving slow and deliberate up the mountain. Behind him, Sarah had moved to the root cellar with Samuel and Mrs. Henderson. The baby was quiet, fed, and sleeping. Small mercy. The riders stopped 200 yards out, far enough to be safe from rifle fire, close enough to make their presence known. One man dismounted, walked forward alone. Well-dressed and even in the wilderness expensive coat and hat, he stopped 100 yards from the cabin, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Caleb Stone, we need to talk." Caleb opened the window shutter, slightly called back. "Nothing to talk about. Turn around and leave." "Can't do that. The woman in there belongs to my organization. She stole property. I'm here to retrieve both. She's my wife. She stays." A pause, then laughter, harsh and disbelieving. "You married a whore from my stable. You have worse taste than I thought." Caleb felt rage flash hot and immediate. He tamped it down, kept his voice level. "Last chance, right away. We're coming up. You can send her out peaceful or we'll take her by force. Your choice." Before Caleb could answer, gunfire erupted from the forest to the east. Not at the cabin, at the 10 riders. Caleb's heart leaped. The townspeople had arrived, had positioned themselves between the cabin and the men, were now forcing the confrontation before it could reach his door. Through the spyglass, he watched chaos unfold. The 10 riders scattered, seeking cover. Return fire came from the trees. Not aimed to kill, he thought. Warning shots, forcing the riders to keep their heads down. Then from the west, more movement. Reverend Crawford on his aging gelding, riding into the open between both groups. The old preacher held his hands high, unarmed, calling for ceasefire. The shooting stopped. Tense silence filled the mountain. Crawford's voice carried clear and strong, despite the distance. "Silas Vance, you and your men are under arrest." The well-dressed man stepped into the open. "On whose authority?" "Mine." Another voice, deeper and harder. A man stepped from the trees wearing a federal marshal's badge. He was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 40, with the look of someone who had enforced law in hard places. "Silas Vance, you're wanted for human trafficking, for fraud, for conspiracy. You can surrender peaceful or we can do this the hard way." Vance laughed again, but this time it sounded strained. "You have no proof. We have testimony from 8 women who were sold through your network. We have a ledger memorized by a witness. We have corroborating evidence from operations in 3 territories. The marshal paused. "And we have warrants signed by a territorial judge. So yes, Mr. Vance, we have proof." Through the spyglass, Caleb watched Vance's face change. Saw the moment the man realized his organization had been exposed. That the woman he hunted had done more damage than he imagined. "The woman lied," Vance tried. "She's unstable. A thief." "The woman is currently nursing a 4-day-old infant in that cabin," Crawford said. "She's also prepared to testify, as are the other 8 women who came forward after her." Sarah had emerged from the root cellar, was standing beside Caleb at the window. "It worked," she whispered. "What I memorized, it actually worked." "You brought down their whole network," Caleb said. On the trail, Vance was calculating odds. 10 men with him, 20 townspeople in the trees, a federal marshal with legal authority. No way to shoot his way out. No way to run through snow this deep. He raised his hand slowly. "I want a lawyer." "You'll get one. In Helena. After you're processed." The marshal gestured and men emerged from the trees. Bishamamaraz. Not all townspeople. Some wore deputy badges. The law had come in force. The arrest took 30 minutes. Vance and his men were disarmed, bound, lined up for the march back to Summit Springs. No shots fired after that first exchange. No blood spilled. Justice delivered through preparation and law, not violence. When it was done, Reverend Crawford rode up to the cabin. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, Sarah beside him, despite Mrs. Henderson's protest that she should be resting. "It's over," Crawford said simply. "The marshal has them. They'll be transported to Helena tomorrow for trial." "How long have you been planning this?" Caleb asked. "Since the day we read Sarah's testimony. We sent it to the territorial authorities." They sent the marshal. He's been investigating for 2 weeks, gathering evidence, building the case. Crawford smiled. Your wife didn't just save herself. She saved dozens of women. Exposed corruption in 3 territories. That's no small thing. Sarah was crying, tears streaming down her face. Not from sadness, from relief, from the weight of 3 years lifting all at once. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you for believing me. And thank you for being brave enough to speak, Crawford replied. That evening, the cabin filled with people again. 20 townsmen, their families, the marshal and his deputies, all crowding into the small space to celebrate. Food appeared from packs and saddlebags. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that made the rounds. Samuel woke and cried. Emma immediately asked to hold him. Soon he was being passed around, admired, blessed by rough men who knew the value of new life. The marshal approached Sarah and Caleb where they stood by the fire. Mrs. Stone, I'll need you to come to Helene to testify when you're recovered and able to travel. When? Sarah asked. April, probably. The trial won't be immediate. They'll try to delay, but we have enough evidence to hold them until then. Will she be safe? Caleb asked. I'll provide protection. And after she testifies, there are programs. Relocation if needed. New identities. Sarah shook her head. I don't need to relocate. I have a home. Right here. The marshal looked at the cabin, at the mountains beyond, at Caleb standing protective beside her. He nodded. Then you'll be safe here. The organization's broken. The powerful men who funded it are scrambling to distance themselves. You won't be hunted anymore. Caleb felt something ease inside him. Not trust exactly, but hope. Hope that maybe they could have the life they had started building. Hope that peace might actually last. Later, after the crowd thinned and people began the long ride back to Summit Springs, Reverend Crawford pulled Caleb aside. You should bring your family to town. Get married proper. In the church. We are married. Spoke vows before God. I know, but for the boy's sake, might be good to have it official, legal and recorded. Caleb looked at Sarah, who was nursing Samuel by the fire. She met his eyes, smiled, nodded. Spring, Caleb said, when she's strong enough to travel. Spring it is. The winter eased slowly into March. Snow still fell, but the sun stayed up longer each day, warming the south-facing slopes until bare ground appeared in patches. Ice on the creek began to break. The wind changed direction, coming from the south now, instead of the north, carrying the promise of thaw. Samuel grew with the fierce intensity of infants, his features taking shape. Caleb's strong jaw. Sarah's green eyes. A temperament that seemed to oscillate between peaceful contentment and volcanic rage depending on whether his needs were met. Caleb learned fatherhood in increments. How to change the cloth diapers without gagging. How to soothe crying at 3 a.m. when Sarah was too exhausted to wake. How to hold his son while walking the perimeter, showing him the mountains that would be his inheritance. Sarah recovered slowly the way women do after childbirth. The bleeding stopped. Her strength returned. She began to move with her old confidence, though now there was an infant on her hip more often than not. They fell into new rhythms, Caleb checking trap lines in the early morning while Sarah nursed Samuel. Both of them working through the day on spring tasks, preparing for the thaw. Evenings by the fire, taking turns holding the baby while the other ate or read or simply existed. It was exhausting. It was also perfect. On the first day of April, Jed arrived with news that the passes were clear enough for travel. Time to make that wedding official, he said. They packed carefully. Supplies for 3 days. Warm clothes for Samuel, who would make his first trip down the mountain, wrapped in furs against his mother's chest. The Winchester, because Caleb would not travel unarmed, even with the threat supposedly ended. The ride to Summit Springs took 2 days instead of the usual one, stopping frequently for Sarah to nurse, for all of them to rest. But the weather held clear and warming, and they reached town in the late afternoon of the second day. Summit Springs had grown in the months since Caleb had last visited. New buildings going up, more people on the streets. The town was changing, becoming less rough camp and more permanent settlement. The church stood at the far end of the main street, white painted wood with a small steeple. Reverend Crawford was waiting on the steps along with Emma and her mother and what looked like half the town. Heard you were coming, Crawford said. Folks wanted to witness. The ceremony was simple. Caleb and Sarah stood before the altar, Samuel between them in Sarah's arms. They spoke the vows they had already spoken once before, but this time there were papers to sign, witnesses to attest legal weight, to give substance to promises already made. When Crawford pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in applause. Samuel woke and cried. Laughter rippled through the congregation. Outside tables had been set up in the street. Food appeared more than Caleb had seen in years. Roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables that must have been precious this time of year. The townspeople had given from their winter stores to celebrate. There was dancing. Caleb danced with Sarah, awkward and stumbling, because he had not danced in 10 years and had never been good at it even then. She laughed at his clumsiness, guided him through the steps, made him feel less foolish than he had any right to. Emma asked to dance with him too. She was nearly 16 now, no longer the wild child who had ridden messages up the mountain, but not quite a woman either, growing into something brave and strong. "Thank you," Caleb said to her during the dance, "for the warnings, for the courage. You gave Mrs. Stone shelter when no one else would. That's worth riding through a blizzard for." "You're a good person, Emma Crawford." She blushed, pleased. When the dance ended, she went to Sarah and asked to hold Samuel. The two of them sat together on a bench, Sarah teaching Emma how to support the baby's head, how to soothe him when he fussed. Watching them, Caleb felt something settle in his chest. This was family. Not just Sarah and Samuel, but Emma and her parents, Jed and Mrs. Henderson. The townspeople who had ridden up the mountain to defend strangers. Family was built, not born, chosen, not given. They stayed in Summit Springs that night, sleeping in a real bed at the boarding house. The mattress felt too soft after months on rope and pine needles. The room felt too enclosed after the cabin's single space. But it was warm and dry, and Samuel slept through most of the night, a miracle they did not take for granted. In the morning, they prepared to ride back up the mountain. The townspeople gathered again to see them off, pressing gifts into their hands, cloth for making baby clothes. A small Bible for Samuel when he was old enough to read. Seeds for a garden Sarah wanted to plant come summer. "You're part of us now," Mrs. Henderson said, hugging Sarah. "Don't be strangers." "We won't," Sarah promised. The ride back was easier than the ride down. Samuel had settled into the rhythm of travel, sleeping against Sarah's chest as the horse climbed steadily into the high country. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks, leaving the trails clear and the meadows beginning to show green. When they came in sight of the cabin, Caleb felt something he had not felt in all his years there. He felt like he was coming home, not to a building, not to solitude, but to the place where his family lived, where his wife waited with their son, where life happened in all its messy, beautiful complications. They settled back into routines that were the same but different. Sarah was stronger now, able to do more of the work. Samuel was more alert, watching everything with wide green eyes. Spring brought new tasks, different rhythms. Caleb cleared ground for Sarah's garden while she sat nearby with Samuel, telling him about the plants they would grow. Tomatoes and squash and beans, herbs for cooking and medicine, creating something that would feed them come winter. He repaired the cabin's roof, replacing shakes damaged by snow, built an addition for a proper bedroom, giving them space to grow into, thinking ahead now in ways he had not for years. In May, wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, purple lupine and red Indian paintbrush and yellow mountain sunflower. Sarah walked through them with Samuel showing him colors he could not yet name, teaching him the world that would be his inheritance. Elk calves appeared in the high meadows, all legs and curiosity. Sarah and Caleb watched them from a distance, Samuel between them, the three of them learning together what it meant to be family in the mountains. June brought the federal marshal back. He rode up alone, dismounting stiffly from a long journey. "Trial's over," he said without preamble. "Vance and 6 of his men convicted. Trafficking, fraud, racketeering. They'll hang before autumn." Sarah was quiet, holding Samuel close. The others turned state's evidence, got lighter sentences in exchange for testimony. They named names all the way to Washington. 3 territorial representatives implicated. 2 judges. It's a scandal that'll take years to clean up. "And the women?" Sarah asked. "The ones who were sold, 23 freed, given assistance to go home or start new lives. Your testimony made that possible." After the marshal left, Sarah sat on the porch with Samuel in her lap. Caleb sat beside her, saying nothing, knowing she needed time to process. 23 women, she finally said. I knew there were more, knew it was bigger than just the 47 I memorized. But hearing the number, knowing they're free, you gave them that. We gave them that. You sheltered me, protected me, made it possible for me to survive long enough to testify. We're partners. That means sharing the victories and the burdens. She leaned against him. Samuel dozed between them. The sun was setting over the western peaks, painting snow orange and gold. I want to write to them, Sarah said. The women who were freed. Let them know they're not alone. You'll need a lot of paper. She smiled. Then we'll get a lot of paper. Summer passed in the rhythm of growth. The garden flourished under Sarah's care. Samuel began to smile, to reach for things, to make sounds that were almost words. The cabin expansion was finished, giving them a bedroom separate from the main room, privacy they had not had before. Caleb taught Samuel to sleep through the night by taking him on long walks at dusk, showing him stars and explaining constellations the baby could not possibly understand. But the walks worked, and Sarah got the rest she desperately needed. Jed visited often, bringing supplies and news from town. Emma came when she could, eager to see Samuel, to help Sarah with the garden, to learn the skills of mountain living. You ever think about teaching? Sarah asked Emma one afternoon while they harvested lettuce. Pa wants me to, says the town needs a school teacher. You'd be good at it. Emma looked at Samuel, who was sleeping in a basket in the shade. I'd rather have what you have, a family, a home, something that matters. Teaching matters, shaping young minds, giving them opportunities. Maybe. Emma was quiet for a moment. Do you ever regret it? Giving up everything to come here. Sarah looked at the cabin, at Caleb chopping wood nearby, at the mountains rising all around. I gave up nothing. I escaped nothing to get here, and found everything. In August, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. She told Caleb while they were working in the garden, Samuel playing nearby with a wooden toy Jed had carved. Already, Caleb said, stunned. Apparently. Sarah touched her belly. I know it's soon. Samuel's barely 5 months old. Are you happy about it? Terrified, but yes, happy. He pulled her close, mindful of Samuel watching them with curious eyes. Then I'm happy too. The second pregnancy was easier than the first. Sarah knew what to expect, how to manage the sickness and fatigue. Her body had not fully recovered from Samuel's birth, but she was strong, adapted to mountain life in ways she had not been the first time. Autumn came with its work of preparing for winter, harvesting the garden, storing food, cutting firewood. Samuel was bigger now, more active, requiring constant watching. Sarah managed it all with a competence that amazed Caleb. In October, Rebecca was born. The labor was faster than Samuel's, only 8 hours from first pain to final push. Mrs. Henderson arrived in time to help Emma with her, and by evening they had a daughter. Rebecca had Sarah's red hair and Caleb's serious expression. Where Samuel had been a loud baby, demanding and fierce, Rebecca was quiet, watchful, content to observe the world from her mother's arms. 2 under a year, Caleb said, holding his daughter while Sarah nursed Samuel. We don't do anything by half measures. Apparently not. That winter was hard, not from weather, but from exhaustion. 2 infants requiring near constant care. Sarah nursing both while trying to manage the household. Caleb taking on more work, giving her time to rest when he could. But they survived it, learned to manage, became a family of 4 in a cabin built for 1. Time passed in the way of mountains. Slow and steady, marked by seasons and growth rather than clocks and calendars. Samuel learned to walk at 13 months, toddling around the cabin with the determination that would define him. Rebecca followed at 14 months, quieter but just as stubborn. They grew into their personalities. Samuel was all action and energy, running before he could walk properly, climbing everything, testing boundaries. Rebecca was thoughtful, patient, content to sit and study a flower or a stone for long minutes. Sarah taught them their letters using a slate Emma brought from town. Caleb taught them the land, taking them on walks to learn trees and tracks and weather signs. By the time Samuel was 6 and Rebecca 5, they could both shoot small rifles, could track deer, could survive a night in the woods if necessary. Not because Caleb pushed them, but because they wanted to learn wanted to be capable in the world they inhabited. In 1883, a school opened in the valley below the cabin. 3 more families had moved in, building their own homesteads, creating a small community. Emma was the teacher, 21, now married to a young farmer, but still eager to educate. Sarah and Caleb debated sending the children. The school was a 2-hour walk each way, too far for small children in winter, too dangerous if weather turned suddenly. But education mattered. Sarah insisted on it, so they compromised. The children would attend in spring and fall when travel was safe. Winter and high summer, they would learn at home. Samuel hated the confinement of the schoolroom, preferred the open mountains. But he learned to read well, to cipher numbers, to write in a careful hand. Rebecca loved school, loved books, loved the structure and order of lessons. They were different, but both holy themselves. Caleb and Sarah had given them that, the freedom to become who they were meant to be. Years passed, the cabin expanded again, adding a second bedroom for the children. The community grew 15 families, now enough to warrant a general store and a small church. Caleb was no longer isolated, had not been for years. But the mountains were still his first home, still the place where truth lived. He went to town for supplies, and community came back to the cabin for peace. Sarah thrived. The girl who had walked up a mountain running from traffickers had become a woman of strength and purpose. She kept the household tended. Her garden taught her children and wrote letters to the women who had been freed, creating a network of survivors who supported each other. In 1890, they faced a crisis that tested everything they had built. Samuel was 14, tall and lean, and restless. He had been talking about leaving, about seeing what lay beyond the mountains. Denver, maybe, or San Francisco. The world beyond the peaks called to him the way it never had to Caleb. One night in June, Samuel did not come home from checking the trap lines. Caleb found his tracks heading east away from the cabin, following the ridge toward the passes that led out of the territory. He rode after his son through the night, tracking by moonlight, following sign that Samuel had not bothered to hide. He found the boy at dawn, sitting on a rock overlooking the eastern valleys, staring at the horizon. Caleb dismounted, sat beside him without speaking. They watched the sun rise together, father and son separated by 14 years, in a gulf of understanding. Finally, Samuel said, "I can't stay here forever." "No one's asking you to." "You stayed." "I stayed because I chose to, because this is where I belonged. You might belong somewhere else." Samuel looked at him, surprised. "You're not going to tell me I'm being foolish. I'm going to tell you that leaving is easy, finding where you belong is hard, and knowing the difference between running away and running toward is harder still. How do I know which I'm doing?" Caleb thought about Margaret, about the mountains, about Sarah walking up a trail in the snow. "You won't, not until you're already gone. But here's what I know. This cabin, these mountains, your mother and sister will be here when you figure it out, whether that's next week or next year or 10 years from now. What if I never come back? Then you never come back, and we'll know you found where you needed to be." They rode home together. Samuel did not leave that summer, but the conversation stayed with Caleb. His children would make their own choices, choose their own paths. All he could do was give them the tools to survive those choices. In 1895, Samuel announced he was staying, not running, choosing deliberately to build his life in the mountains. He had met a girl in the valley, Emma's younger sister Anna, and they planned to marry. Caleb felt relief and pride mixed together. His son had considered leaving, had weighed the world beyond the peaks, and chosen to stay. Not from fear or obligation, but from genuine love of the land. Rebecca, meanwhile, announced she was leaving. For Teachers College in Helena, she wanted to learn to teach, to bring education to frontier communities. She would come back, she promised, but she needed to grow beyond the mountains first. Sarah cried when Rebecca left. Caleb held her, understanding. Their daughter was not running away, she was running towards something, and they had to trust that she would find it. In 1900, Samuel married Anna. The wedding was held in the Valley Church, the whole community attending. Caleb gave his son away with hands that shook slightly, not from age but from emotion. Watching Samuel stand with Anna speaking vows that echoed the ones Caleb had spoken 24 years earlier, he felt the weight of time. His son was a man now, building his own life, creating his own family. In 1905, Rebecca returned from Helena, degree in hand, and opened a school in Summit Springs. She was 25, unmarried, content with her independence. She visited the cabin often, bringing books for her parents, stories of her students' laughter that filled the rooms. That same year, Samuel and Anna had their first child, a son they named Daniel. Caleb held his grandson and felt the circle complete. He was 64 now, hair gone gray, movements slower than they once were. But his mind was clear and his hands were steady, and he could still track elk through new snow. Sarah was 56 hair silver laugh lines deep around her eyes. She was still beautiful to him, still the woman who had walked up a mountain and changed everything. They sat on the porch one evening watching Daniel play in the yard while Samuel and Anna looked on with the bemused exhaustion of new parents. "You ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Staying here instead of running to Helena?" "Never once. Not even when it was hard. Especially not then. The hard parts are what made it real." She took his hand. "We built something worth keeping. That matters more than easy ever could." The years turned. 1906, 1907, 1908. Daniel growing from infant to toddler to young boy. More grandchildren coming, filling the valley with noise and life. Caleb slowed but did not stop. Still checked trap lines, though not as far. Still cut wood, though. Samuel did most of the heavy work now. Still walked the land with Wolf's successor, a half-wild dog named Shadow. Sarah slowed too, but in different ways. Her hands grew stiff with arthritis, but she still tended her garden. Her eyes weakened, but she still wrote letters to the network of women she had helped free. They grew old together in the mountains exactly as they had planned. In 1911, on a November evening, much like the one when Sarah had first arrived, Caleb sat in his cabin with Daniel. The boy was 18 now, tall and strong, with Samuel's build and Sarah's green eyes. He had been working construction, good honest labor. But now there was talk of the Panama Canal of jobs that paid well for men willing to risk fever and jungle dangers. Daniel was preparing to leave the way young men do when the world calls them. And Caleb, remembering his own restlessness at that age, his own need to test himself against something larger than daily routine, understood. So he opened the old wooden trunk and pulled out the Winchester, the rosary, the photograph. And he began to tell the story. He told it all. The isolation, the woman in black, the slow building of trust, the vows spoken by firelight, the men who came hunting the community that stood together. Samuel's birth in the storm, Rebecca's quiet arrival, the years of building and growing and becoming a family. Daniel listened through the night firelight painting shadows on the cabin walls. When Caleb finished, dawn was breaking over the peaks. "So grandmother Sarah was running," Daniel said, "and you gave her a place to stop." "We gave each other that," Caleb corrected. "She stopped running. I stopped hiding. We built something real in the space between." The men who hunted her, what happened to them? Hanged, justice served, but that's not the important part of the story. What is? That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to stop, to stand somewhere and say, "This is mine. I claim it, I build it, I defend it." Running is easy, standing is hard. Sarah appeared in the doorway, 70 now, but still strong, still beautiful in the way that mattered. She crossed to them, placed the rosary in Daniel's hand. "This saved me once," she said. "Maybe it'll watch over you in that jungle." Caleb handed him the Winchester. "This brought me home from every hunt. Carried it 35 years. It'll bring you home too." Daniel held the rifle. The rosary looked at his grandparents with something like awe. "I will come back. You know that, right?" "We know," Caleb said. "You're a stone. We always find our way home." In the morning, they stood on the porch and watched Daniel ride down the mountain. The sun was rising, painting snow gold on the highest peaks. Sarah leaned against Caleb, his arm around her shoulders. "Think he'll be all right?" she asked. "He's got your courage and Samuel's stubbornness. He'll be fine. And if he's not, then he'll learn, same as we did." They stood together until Daniel disappeared from view. Then they went inside to the life they had built over 35 years, to the cabin that had sheltered them through storms and seasons, and the raising of a family. Wolf's successor, Shadow, lay by the fire. The coffee pot was still warm. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging. Inside, two people who had found each other in the wilderness held on to each other still. 9 years later, in 1920, Sarah Stone sat on the cabin porch surrounded by great-grandchildren. Caleb had died in 1918 peacefully in his sleep, the way mountain men deserved to go. She had buried him on the ridge overlooking the valley, where he could watch the elk move through the meadows and the sunrise over the peaks he had loved. She was 69 now, still living in the cabin with Samuel and Anna's family. Rebecca visited often, brought books and news from Summit Springs. Daniel had survived Panama, and the war. Both had come home whole and married, lived in the valley with his own family. The great-grandchildren played in the yard, four of them ranging from 3 to 8 years old. The youngest, a girl named Sarah, after her climbed into her lap. "Tell us a story, great-grandmother." Sarah smiled, settled the child more comfortably. The other three gathered close. "Once a long time ago," she began, "I walked into these mountains running from bad men. I was scared and alone and didn't know if I would survive the night." "But you did," the 8-year-old said. He had heard this story before. "I did, because a man opened his door, a man who didn't trust anyone, who had lived alone for 8 years, who had every reason to turn me away." "But he didn't," the little girl in her lap said. "No, he gave me shelter and coffee and taught me to shoot. And somewhere in that winter, we stopped being strangers and became partners. Then we became more." She looked at the mountains, at the cabin Caleb had built, at the life they had created from nothing but choice and courage. "Your great-grandfather showed me that mountains don't judge. They just teach you to stand, to be who you are without pretending, to choose what matters and defend it." "Even when it's scary?" the youngest asked. "Especially then. Fear's not the enemy. Letting fear decide for you, that's the enemy." The children were quiet, absorbing this. Then the 8-year-old asked, "Do you miss him?" "Every day, but he's still here." She pointed to the grave on the ridge. "In these mountains, in you, in every choice we make to be brave instead of easy." Wind moved through the pines, sounding like Caleb's quiet voice. Sarah closed her eyes, listened, remembered. The cabin was still standing. The land was still wild. The family they had built was still growing, spreading into the valley, carrying forward the lessons learned in this place. She had walked up a mountain alone and desperate, had found a man as lost as she was. Together they had built something that outlasted fear, and outlasted danger, and outlasted everything but love and time. The mountains had taught them both to stand. In standing together, they had created a legacy that would endure long after the cabin fell to ruin and the graves weathered into the earth. That evening, after the children had been taken home and the cabin was quiet, Sarah walked to the ridge where Caleb rested. The sun was setting, painting everything gold. "Still here," she said to the stone that marked his grave. "Still standing, like you taught me." The wind answered, moving through the pines, carrying the scent of coming snow. Winter was coming again, the way it always did, the way it always would. But Sarah was not afraid of winter anymore. Had not been for 44 years. Not since the night a mountain man opened his door and taught her that sanctuary was not a place. It was a choice, and she had chosen well.